The first time I realized strangers were using my land as a road, it honestly took me a minute to even understand what I was looking at. Because when you live out where I do, you get used to quiet. Real quiet. The kind where the loudest thing most evenings is the wind brushing through the grass, and maybe a pickup rolling by every once in a while. So when headlights suddenly appeared cutting straight across my backfield one evening, my brain didn't immediately register it as a problem. I thought maybe someone was lost. Then another pair of headlights followed. Then another. And that's when I sat up a little straighter on the porch. Now for context, my name's Daniel Mercer. I've lived outside the town of Redfield, Colorado for about 12 years. Redfield's one of those places that used to be nothing more than a gas station, a diner, and a hardware store with a dusty bell on the door. But over the past few years, the place started growing. Developers came in. New houses popped up. An office park went up on the north side of town. And suddenly the quiet little roads around here weren't so quiet anymore. Still, my property sat in this odd little strip of land between two paved roads. About 5 acres. Nothing fancy, just open grass, a small barn, and the house I built with my brother years ago. When I bought the land, nobody cared about those roads. One barely had traffic. The other mostly led to ranch land. But now, one of those roads feeds straight into the new Redfield Commerce Park, and the other runs right into a fast-growing neighborhood called Maple Ridge. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just staring out at my field watching cars drive across it like it had always been a road. One sedan rolled through, slow and steady, cutting a diagonal path through the grass. Then an SUV followed the exact same line. Same entry point off the pavement, same exit toward the gravel road behind my barn. No hesitation, no confusion, just routine. And that's the moment the weird feeling settled in my stomach. I stood up from my porch chair, walked down the steps, and headed out into the field. By the time I got halfway across the grass, another car came through. A white Honda this time. The driver barely glanced at me standing there. Just drove right past like I was part of the scenery. When the dust settled, I looked down at the ground and saw it clearly. Tire tracks. Dozens of them. They carved a straight line through my field, connecting one road to the other like someone had taken a ruler and drawn a shortcut across my property. I remember standing there thinking, when the hell did this start? Because it obviously wasn't new. The grass was flattened down so hard in that path, it was already starting to turn brown. That night, I didn't sleep great. You ever have one of those thoughts that sits in the back of your mind and just keeps poking you? That was me staring at the ceiling around midnight thinking about strangers driving across land I paid taxes on every year. The next morning I decided to test something. I made coffee, grabbed a folding chair, and sat by the side of the field where the cars had been entering. Just waited. First car showed up at 7:12 in the morning. A dark blue pickup. Guy had a coffee cup in his hand, one elbow hanging out the window. He didn't even slow down. Turned off the road like he'd done it 100 times. Second car came 3 minutes later. Then another. Then two almost back to back. By the time an hour passed, I had counted 27 vehicles. 27. Not one person stopped. Not one person waved. Nobody rolled down their window to say, hey, sorry about this. They all just cut through like my land had magically become public infrastructure overnight. Around the 10th car, I actually stepped closer to the path, thinking maybe someone would hesitate. They didn't. One guy in a gray sedan even gestured impatiently for me to move aside. That was the moment the irritation started creeping in. Not rage yet, just that slow burning feeling of, hold on a second. After the morning rush slowed down, I got in my truck and drove over to the Commerce Park. The place had one of those little security booths at the entrance. A young guard sat inside scrolling on his phone. I leaned out my window and asked him something simple. Hey, you know anything about people cutting through the field off County Road 14? He barely looked up. Oh yeah, he said. Everyone uses that. Everyone. That word stuck in my head. I asked him who owned the land. He shrugged. Some guy, he said. But it saves people like 10 minutes. I remember smiling politely, thanking him, and driving away. But inside, something had shifted. Because apparently, I was the only person in this entire situation who understood a pretty basic concept. It was my land. When I got home, I pulled the survey paperwork out of the file cabinet in my office. Spread it across the kitchen table. 5 acres. Clear boundaries. No easements. No shared access. No public right-of-way. Legally speaking, Those tire tracks running through my grass might as well have been driving across my living room floor. And that's when I realized something interesting. Nobody had asked. Nobody had knocked on my door. Nobody had even tried to pretend this shortcut belonged to them. They had simply decided it did. And the strange part was, they weren't entirely wrong. Because the path was already forming. Every new car packed the dirt a little tighter. Every day the grass disappeared a little more. Soon enough it would look exactly like a road. And people believe roads when they see them. So I didn't block it right away. Instead, I watched. Because sometimes if you let a problem grow just a little bigger, you learn exactly how people really think. And trust me, what I learned over the next couple weeks told me everything I needed to know. For the next couple of weeks, I didn't block the shortcut. I didn't yell at anyone. Didn't put up a fence. Didn't even put up a sign. Instead, I did something that probably would have looked strange if anyone had noticed. I watched. Every morning I'd sit on the porch with coffee and a notebook. Not in some angry surveillance way, more like quiet curiosity. I wanted to understand how this whole thing had happened. Because shortcuts don't just appear overnight. Someone starts it. Then someone else notices. Then suddenly everyone acts like it's always been there. The traffic patterns told the story. Morning rush started around 7 o'clock. Mostly commuters heading toward the office park. Pickup trucks, sedans, a couple Teslas that seemed wildly out of place bouncing across my dirt field. Then around lunchtime the rideshare drivers started showing up. DoorDash, Uber, Instacart. Those folks always had their phones mounted on the dash, GPS telling them the fastest route. And apparently the fastest route was straight across Daniel Mercer's backyard. One afternoon, I watched a delivery van barrel through doing at least 30. The driver hit a bump in the field, and a stack of cardboard boxes tipped sideways inside the truck. He didn't slow down, just kept going like it was an interstate. By the second week, the path had completely changed the landscape. The grass was gone, replaced by packed dirt and dust. When cars passed through, a light brown cloud would drift across the field and settle on my fence posts. Then one evening I walked out there after dinner and saw something that made my jaw tighten. Trash. Just little things at first. A crushed soda cup. A fast food wrapper. Then a cigarette butt. You ever notice how quickly people stop respecting a place once they think nobody owns it? I stood there in the fading sunlight holding that greasy paper wrapper, and I remember saying out loud, well, that answers that. Because up until that moment, a small part of me had still wondered if maybe this whole thing was just a misunderstanding. Maybe people assumed the land belonged to the county. Maybe they thought it was in used property. But litter tells a different story. People don't throw trash where they think someone's watching. They throw it where they believe nobody cares. That night I sat down at the kitchen table and started making calls. First call was to a local landscaper named Eddie Morales. Good guy, did some grading work for me years ago when I first moved in. I told him what was going on and asked a simple question. If someone keeps driving across dirt long enough, what happens when it rains? Eddie chuckled. Well, he said, eventually it turns into a mud pit. Then I asked another question. What's the easiest way to control water runoff across a field? Now that question got his attention. He started talking about drainage channels, grading slopes, soil displacement. I didn't interrupt much. Just listened. Next call was to a civil engineer out of Redfield named Karen Holt. Karen was the kind of person who spoke in calm, precise sentences, like she measured every word before saying it. I explained the situation. She asked one question. Is the path lower than the surrounding land? Barely, I said. That's perfect, she replied. Then she walked me through something interesting. See, when land gets compacted from vehicle traffic, it actually stops absorbing water the same way grass does. Rainwater starts running across the surface instead of soaking in, which means if you shape the land properly, you can legally install a drainage ditch to prevent flooding. Perfectly normal agricultural practice. Perfectly legal. And perfectly inconvenient for anyone trying to drive across it. The final call I made was to the county office, just to double-check there weren't any weird regulations I didn't know about. The woman on the phone looked up my parcel number. No easements, she said. No access agreements. Then she added something interesting. As long as your drainage work stays within your property line and meets runoff guidelines, you're free to manage the land however you want. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a long minute staring out the kitchen window toward the field. Headlights were cutting across it again. 3 cars in a row. And that's when the plan really settled in. I wasn't going to block the shortcut with a fence. Fences start fights. What I was going to build was something a lot more polite, something quiet, something legal, something that technically had nothing to do with traffic at all. The following Monday, Eddie brought his equipment out, just a small excavator and a pickup truck. Nothing dramatic. If you drove past the property that morning, you might have assumed we were doing normal land maintenance, which technically we were. The ditch itself wasn't deep, maybe 2 feet at most, but it was wide, and it ran perfectly along the path those cars had carved through my field. Karen had helped map the slope so rainwater would drain properly during storms. We shaped the sides smooth, clean edges, professional work. When Eddie finished, he stood there looking at it and said something that made me laugh. "Well," he said, "no one's driving through that unless they brought a canoe." But I wasn't trying to trap anybody, so I added a few extra touches. Reflective posts along both sides, bright orange markers, and a couple warning signs that read, "Private property, no vehicle access, clear, visible, impossible to miss." By late afternoon, the whole thing was done. Eddie packed up his equipment and headed out. Before he left, he asked, "You think people are going to try it anyway?" I smiled. "Oh, absolutely. Because here's the thing about shortcuts. Once people believe they belong to them, taking them away doesn't go quietly." That evening, I sat on the porch again with a cold drink and waited. Right around sunset, the first car came down County Road 14. Silver SUV. Same one I'd seen at least 5 times that week. The driver turned off the pavement without hesitation and then suddenly slammed on the brakes. The front of the car dipped as he stared at the ditch. He sat there for a second like his brain couldn't quite process what had happened. Then he slowly backed up, turned around, and drove away. I'll admit, I chuckled. But the real show started the next morning. Rush hour hit at exactly the same time as always. First commuter rolled up and stopped. Second car pulled up behind them. Third car joined the line. Within 5 minutes, 3 drivers had gotten out of their vehicles staring down at the ditch like it had personally insulted them. One guy in a suit actually looked over toward my porch. I gave him a friendly wave. He did not wave back. By the end of that first day, word had clearly started spreading. Some drivers approached slowly, already suspicious. Others rolled up confidently, then jerked to a stop like they'd just discovered gravity stopped working. By the end of the week, the situation had escalated. Traffic backed up on both connecting roads. Drivers argued with each other. Someone moved one of my warning posts and tried to angle their truck across the ditch. That lasted about 2 seconds before they realized their tires would drop straight in. But the real entertainment wasn't happening in my field. It was happening online. Redfield has one of those local Facebook groups where everyone posts about lost dogs, garage sales, and potholes. Suddenly, the page exploded with complaints. Who blocked the shortcut behind Maple Ridge? This is ridiculous. That path's been there for years. Someone even wrote, the property owner should be forced to reopen it. I remember reading that comment and laughing out loud, because now the conversation had shifted. People weren't asking permission anymore. They were demanding access. And it didn't take long before the complaints reached someone official. One afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID said Redfield City Office. The man on the other end introduced himself as Greg Lawson from the planning department. His voice was calm, but carried that careful tone bureaucrats use when they're about to ask a question they already think they know the answer to. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we've received several reports about a drainage structure you recently installed that appears to be blocking an informal access route." I leaned back in my chair, took a slow sip of coffee, and said the first thing that came to mind. "Well, Greg," I said, "I guess the rainwater's going to be real happy about that." There was a pause on the line. The conversation that followed turned out to be a lot more interesting than he expected. There was a pause on the line after I made that comment about the rainwater. Not a long pause, just long enough for Greg Lawson from the planning department to realize this conversation probably wasn't going to go the way he expected. He cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "the concern we're hearing from several residents is that this route has been used for quite some time." I leaned back in the chair at my kitchen table, looking out the window toward the field where the ditch sat quietly under the afternoon sun. "Used by who?" I asked. Another pause. "Drivers in the area?" I couldn't help smiling. "Greg," I said, "I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I promise I'm not trying to make this difficult. All right, who authorized those drivers to cross my land?" Silence. Not awkward silence. More like the sound of someone mentally flipping through pages that didn't have the answer they needed. "Well," he said finally. The route developed naturally. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, I said. So did the ditch. That line seemed to land harder than I expected, because suddenly the tone shifted. Greg stopped talking like someone trying to gently nudge a solution out of me, and started sounding like a man realizing he didn't actually have any authority here. Just to clarify, he said, you installed the drainage structure entirely within your property boundary? Correct. And it meets runoff regulations? Had an engineer help with that? Another pause. Then he sighed a little. Well, legally speaking, you're within your rights. I could almost hear the frustration behind those words. But the story didn't end there, because a couple days later someone else showed up. This time in person. I was in the barn fixing a loose hinge on one of the stall doors when a dark gray company SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a tall guy in a pressed button-down shirt and slacks that probably cost more than my truck. He walked toward the barn with the confident stride of someone used to getting what he wanted. Mr. Mercer, he called. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked out to meet him. That's me. He extended a hand. Ryan Caldwell. I manage operations over at Redfield Commerce Park. Oh, now the real conversation was starting. We shook hands. Firm grip, practiced smile. He glanced past me toward the field where the ditch cut across the dirt path like a quiet little canyon. So, he said, I imagine you know why I'm here. Got a pretty good guess. Ryan let out a small breath through his nose. Well, to be completely honest, that route has been extremely helpful for our employees. It cuts commute time significantly. I nodded. Yeah, I've noticed folks seem to like it. He gave a polite chuckle, then gestured toward the field. Look, I understand it's your property. No one's disputing that. But the route's already established. People depend on it. That word again. Depend. I leaned against the barn door and said something I'd been thinking for a while. You know what else saves time? Ryan tilted his head. What's that? Trespassing. For the first time since he arrived, the polished corporate smile cracked just a little. He didn't get angry, though. I'll give him credit for that. Instead, he tried a different angle. Well, maybe there's a middle ground here. Oh, we could improve the path. Gravel it properly. Make sure it stays clean. No. He blinked once. All right, we could maintain it. Snow removal in winter. Dust control. No. The smile was gone now. So you're just closing it permanently? I shrugged. Seems like the easiest solution. Ryan studied me for a moment, like he was trying to decide whether I was stubborn, unreasonable, or just playing a longer game. Then he asked the question he'd clearly been saving. What if we compensated you for access? Now that got my attention. Not because I wanted money exactly, but because it meant the conversation had finally reached the point where reality had entered the room. Depends, I said. On what? On the details. Ryan relaxed a little when he heard that. Negotiation. That was a language he understood. Over the next 15 minutes, we stood there talking through possibilities. He suggested a permanent gravel road. I said no. He suggested paving it. I laughed. Finally, I laid out something simple. Access could be limited. How limited? Daytime hours only. He frowned. That would defeat the purpose for commuters. Then it probably isn't worth much, is it? Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. What about unrestricted access with maintenance payments? Liability stays with you, I said immediately. For what? For anything that happens on the crossing. Now he was quiet again, because suddenly the shortcut wasn't just a convenience anymore. It was a responsibility. After about 20 minutes, Ryan checked his watch. Well, he said, I'll need to take this back to the company. Sounds good. We shook hands again. He drove off. And for 2 weeks, nothing happened. Meanwhile, the traffic situation got worse. Without the shortcut, drivers had to use the main intersection between the two roads. Turns out that intersection wasn't built to handle the extra load. Morning backups stretched half a mile. People complained. Loudly. The Maple Ridge Facebook group basically turned into a digital war zone. Some folks blamed me. Others blamed the office park for not planning proper access roads. Local radio even mentioned it one morning. Unexpected congestion near the Redfield Commerce Park area. Every time I heard about it, I just shook my head and went about my day. Because none of that traffic had anything to do with me. About 15 days after Ryan's visit, the gray SUV came back. This time he wasn't alone. A second car pulled in behind him, and a woman stepped out carrying a folder. Ryan approached with a different expression than before. Not frustrated, not confident either. More like someone who had reached the point where reality finally wins. Mr. Mercer, he said, we'd like to propose a formal easement agreement. Now that word, easement, changes everything. Because once something's written down legally, everyone knows exactly where they stand. We went inside the house and sat at the kitchen table. The woman with him, a lawyer named Allison Pierce, slid the paperwork across the table. I read every line carefully. Then I grabbed a pen. Ryan watched as I crossed out 3 sections, added 2 clauses, and wrote something new into the agreement. He leaned forward. What are those changes? I tapped the page. The ditch stays. He frowned. Then how would vehicles cross? Single controlled crossing point. Allison looked intrigued. Like a culvert bridge? Exactly. Ryan exchanged a glance with her. And these? He asked, pointing to another line I'd written. Removable barriers, I said. Access can be closed anytime. That seems restrictive. Last clause. I added, tapping the bottom of the page. Ryan read it silently. If access rules are violated, the easement is immediately revoked. He leaned back in the chair. That gives you a lot of control. I nodded. Funny how property works like that. For a moment the room went quiet. You could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating commute times, employee complaints, construction costs. Outside, a few cars drove past on the main road, probably adding another 10 minutes to someone's drive home. Ryan finally sighed. We'll need to review this. Of course. 3 days later they signed. Construction crews came out the following week. They installed a proper drainage culvert across the ditch, right where I approved. Put up reflective signage. And 2 heavy removable gates. Now there's exactly one place vehicles can cross my land. 1. And every driver who uses it knows something they didn't know before. That shortcut doesn't belong to them. It never did. Sometimes when I sit on the porch in the evening, I watch the cars line up at that controlled crossing point. They slow down. They follow the rules. And I can't help thinking about how strange people are. For weeks they treated my land like it was public. But the moment a contract got involved, suddenly everyone understood boundaries. Now here's the part I'm still curious about. Because depending on who you ask around Redfield, I'm either the guy who solved a traffic problem, or the stubborn landowner who caused it in the first place. And honestly, I'm not sure which one people believe more. So I'm curious what you think. If strangers started using your land like it was their road, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have shut it down completely and never opened it again? Let me know in the comments. I read every one of them.